they prepared to lay Tyre Nichols to rest, his family looking for change he'll never see.
We got a long fight ahead of us.
That's right. Yeah.
And we got to stay strong for it.
Outrage and determination has spread across the country in the wake of Nichols' death and the release of videos showing officers beating Nichols. Today in Philadelphia at the Museum of the American Revolution, Pennsylvania Governor
Tyre Nichols was a 29-year-old black man who lived in Memphis, Tennessee. His mother described him as living a simple and pleasant life. He worked for FedEx, loved to skateboard, was an amateur photographer, and he also had a 4-year-old son. On the evening of January 7th, after a traffic stop, Tyre was violently beaten and pepper sprayed by the police. He sustained severe injuries. He died on January 10th. There is something notable about this event, however, and it's the fact that all 5 officers implicated in his killing are black, and they are also part of an elite unit, and that seem to have been especially empowered to crack down on crime in Memphis. This elite unit is called Scorpion Unit, and it's similar to what Nigerians would understand as SARS, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad that caused a lot of uproar in October of 2020 and led to a lot of violence against citizens of Nigeria. So this is kind of the SARS of Memphis. And if you watch the video, you would also see or feel that these officers did what they did quite brazenly, as if they had some kind of assurance that nothing was going to happen to them. Definitely, probably not the first time they're infringing on someone's rights that much. That's not something we're quite used to. The thing we're used to is usually brutality of black men in the hands of a white police officer. So I didn't quite know how to process it when I saw these pictures online and of these 5 black men having been implicated in the death of another black man. Memphis is a majority black city, and it has a majority black police force. And the idea is that if the demography of the police force is if it mirrors those of the city, if it matches those of the city, that it would make a difference and close the gap between the police and the community and hopefully prevent things like this. But that has not happened in this case. And it's probably more of an indictment on the police culture more generally. And the fact that the race of a police officer does not quite make much of a difference between, bridging the divisions between the police and the community. There is something fundamental that happens when the police puts on their uniform that encourages brutality towards black people, regardless of the race of the police officer. Now let's move on to politics. And on politics, George Santos, who you might have heard in the news, the Republican congressman from New York, who has admitted to fabricating much of his biography and resume, has agreed to temporarily step down from 2 committee assignments in the House of Representatives. The vast majority of people who live in his district want him to step down. About 78% of voters in his district want him to leave Congress. So that's quite interesting. Let's move on to the Democratic Party. Iowa is in the news. For the past 50 years, when it comes to the race for who becomes the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, that context usually begins in Iowa. You all know that. Even if you don't live in the United States, Iowa is always in the news when it comes to presidential elections or Democratic national conventions, because they start there for some reason. But Joe Biden is trying to abandon this age-long tradition. He's trying to abandon it in favor of younger, more racially diverse states like Georgia and New Hampshire. Republicans hold sway in Iowa. So Joe Biden is nursing this idea of moving the first pivotal conference or convention out of Iowa to some other states that might be more amenable or more loyal to the party's messaging, at least during this coming election cycle. To the state of the U.S. economy, everyone knows there's inflation currently, and the government is doing everything within its power to try to curb it and address it. The housing market is a pillar of the American economy, and it's quite important to look at what is happening in the housing market when you're trying to gauge the health of the U.S. economy. The typical sales price of an existing family home in the U.S. in December was $372,000. This reflects a pretty steady housing market, despite the fears of what people thought might be an housing crash in the aftermath of the pandemic. And also because the Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates, and that has a very strong impact on what happens in the housing market. So people thought the housing market was going to crash, but it has not crashed. Prices have not crashed. So most forecasters expect home prices to fall, but not as drastically as some people were thinking would happen. And that decline is actually expected to take a while to happen. Let's move on to layoffs. The number of layoffs in the tech sector since January, the beginning of this year, is 76,000. 76,000 people have been laid off in the tech sector since the beginning of the year. That's about 2,500 tech workers laid off in a day. This is quite unnerving, but most of these layoffs have been isolated to the better paying white collar type jobs, and the labor market still actually looks quite strong. That is, what's happening in the tech sector is not necessarily reflective of the overall job market. Unemployment rate, for example, is still at 3.5%, and that is a 50-year low. That is, unemployment has not been that low in the past 50 years. Also, there are 10.5 million jobs that are currently open. Hundreds of thousands of jobs are being added on net every month. So yes, people may be losing their jobs, but they can get another one if they really want to. I'm not, of course, understating the anxiety or the fears that people who lose their jobs might be facing. Consumer spending fell by 0.2% in December. These are early signs of the fact that consumers might be beginning to pull back their spending. You all know that in the pandemic, government gave out a lot of money, a lot of stimulus money for states, for people, for businesses, big businesses, small businesses. People were not also able to spend their money. People were unable to travel, so people saved a lot of money. As 2022 came around, people traveled a lot. They were able to spend all of that stimulus money and all of that savings. And so this is probably early signs that consumers are beginning to pull back, that those excess money is probably beginning to dry up. While 0.2% decline is small, you don't want to see a month-over-month decline in consumer spending, because that would mean the onset of a recession. If consumers are not buying stuff, then retailers have to stop buying as well and lay off workers, and that could spiral out of control and lead to a recession. For some reason, the price of eggs has become a measure of inflation in the US. The price of eggs have increased 60% over the past year. And there are accusations of the fact that egg producers are actually colluding and doing egg fixing, producing eggs but not selling it, or selling it to the highest bidder or something like that. Anyway, some people have become clever and they've started renting a chicken to satisfy their egg needs. This is definitely not the most economical way to get eggs, because it's more expensive. If you rent a chicken, you have to feed the chicken, you have to take care of the chicken, you have to, it's just more work at the end of the day. But I think people are just enjoying the novelty of it. The US is bringing the public health emergency declaration to an end on May 11th. Since January 2020, the public health emergency has been renewed every 90 days. This was what made it possible to get tested fast, to get tested free of charge, to also get vaccines fast. It was this national health emergency that gave the federal government a lot of power to respond to the crisis, and gave it a lot of power to skip a lot of steps and navigate some potential roadblocks in addressing the public health crisis. It gave a lot of money to the states too, so that they could address those needs at the local level. So it's that emergency that the government is thinking about putting an end to right now. The World Health Organization doesn't quite still thinks that COVID remains a global emergency, although they say that the end of the pandemic may be in sight, and it estimates that about 90% of the world population has some level of immunity to COVID due to either being vaccinated or being infected and developing some immunity to the virus from that infection. But what does this mean for you, and what does it mean for me? It means three things. It means that, the healthcare system will now treat COVID as any other disease. Tests will no longer be free, vaccines will no longer be free, and you may have to pay more for treatment. And test and treatment, access to all of that may be more complicated. It also means that, pharmaceutical companies would now be able to charge a lot for treatments. Pfizer and Moderna have said that they would charge between $80 to $130 per vaccine. So you can imagine how much money and how much revenue they would get. The third implication of the fact that the pandemic is coming to an end is Title 42. Title 42 was a policy implemented under the Trump administration, and it allowed Border Patrol officers to send back migrants who were crossing from Mexico into the U.S. It was a public health order because the thinking was that if you allowed more people to come into the country, then that was a health risk, and so they wanted to limit the amount of people that was able to cross into the United States. But now, if the public health emergency that allowed Title 42 to be in place is being put to an end, then there will be no need for Title 42. That means more people may be able to cross into the United States from Mexico and from other countries without much of a restriction. All the politics that surrounds that, and immigration policy and border policy, it's not the subject of this video, so let's just move on. Right, let's move on to the China spy balloon. This is probably the most interesting piece of news that came out during the week. The size of 3 school buses floated in or flown in from Canada, flew over Montana at about 60,000 feet, and was hovering over the continental United States for a lot of days and hours. And China was like, well, everybody should just calm down because it's just a weather balloon and everyone should relax. Pentagon officials have been quite tight-lipped about what they know and what they are planning to do. The Secretary of State has postponed a planned visit to China because of this spy balloon. The president has been criticized for not simply shooting down the balloon. And now there are reports that the president may have actually given the order to shoot down the balloon. This might be
different official. No, I believe it just happened there. That was it. Live, raw, and unfiltered. It appears that China spy balloon.
This is quite symbolic in a few ways. The fact that a China spy balloon could spend a lot of time in the U.S. airspace, and it's China just trying to set up this retaliatory dynamic between the United States and China. China is not happy about a few things that the U.S. just did around a few bills that just passed that kind of puts them at a technological disadvantage in terms of availability to chips and things like that. So China is not happy about that. So China is not going to begin a war with the United States. It's not like they don't need to send a spy balloon to see a few things that they're interested in seeing in the United States. No, they have satellites hovering over the United States all the time. So this is not giving them any new or interesting capabilities. They're just trying to introduce some interesting dialogue into the polity of the United States. The tensions between the United States and China has always been there. And I don't think there's any World War III imminent. If anything were to happen between China and the United States, China probably has a lot more to lose. Everybody would lose, but China probably has a lot more to lose. So I don't see them as trying to do anything or send any interesting signals. But once they can get people talking about China in the United States, they get both political parties riled up and beating at each other. If you look on Fox News right now, you probably see them, castigating the president about whatever action he has taken or hasn't taken. If you look on the other liberal-leaning news outlets too, you will see them justifying whatever the president has done or hasn't done. All right, so that's all China is trying to do, trying to, just get people talking about China. And when that happens, China wins. When people in the United States are beating each other and talking at each other, China ends up on the winning side. Well, as you may know, Nigeria's presidential race elections would happen on February 25th. It's a Saturday, unlike the United States that put their elections on Tuesday. It's a Saturday, so many people hopefully would be able to vote. About 90% of Nigerians think the country is headed in the wrong direction. You probably agree to that if you're Nigerian. There are three big contenders for this presidential election. There's the 70-year-old Bola Ahmed Tinubu, whose path to victory is probably the clearest. His party is the incumbent, although the president hasn't been quite vocal in his support of him. And he has also criticized some of the decisions of the president on the campaign trail. Well, but his path to victory is probably the most well-defined. He has deep pockets, and his party controls 21 of the 36 governorships in the country. And then there is Mr. Atiku Abubakar, 76-year-old, quite wealthy. He's been a vice president before. Has a lot of corruption allegations that have been levied against him, but he says none of these allegations have been substantiated. So everybody should stop talking. And of course, there is Mr. Peter Obi. He's 61 years old. He's a former governor and a trader, a quite successful businessman. His support has come largely from the youth population of the country, although there are those who would argue that support has actually moved beyond the youth and is now even more mainstream than the other contenders in the elections. He's Christian and he doesn't belong to any of the two parties. His path to victory is probably the most narrow because he doesn't control any state in the country. His party does not control any of the states in the country. But he seems to be the one that has the most support and people are most excited for. People that don't want the old guard and don't want to continue business as usual are most excited about him. There's an interesting poll here that I would just want to show you guys finally. When people were asked if the election were held today, who would you most likely vote for? This was done in December of 2022. 23% of people said they would vote for Peter Obi, 13% said they would vote for the APC presidential candidate, and 10% said they would vote for Atiku Abubakar. So you see, it's quite a large margin. But the undecided and those who refused is quite telling. Most people make their decisions on the election day, maybe when they get to their polling stations, depending on the encouragement that they receive or not. But you see where Peter Obi has a stronghold in the south, in the southeast, and in the north central. Some in the southwest, but that's where he's likely to get a lot of his votes from. But it's going to be quite an interesting election cycle in Nigeria, and all eyes are on these elections. Most people want a change, and they want to see a better country. All right, that's the end of this week one of news clips. If you like this kind of content, a summary of the week's biggest news items, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with people who might enjoy it as well.